Hi everyone, my name is Joanna, and I am a Deputy Chief Adjudicator for Clemson University USUDC 2019, and I am going to be talking about the types of motions that you might expect to see at this tournament, and what type of debate each motion is asking you to have. Broadly, there are three types of motions that we debate. The first are policy motions, which are this House would debates. The second are actor motions, which is this House as a particular actor would do a particular thing. And the third are analysis motions, which are this House believes that, this House believes that X should, this House supports or opposes, etc. Before I talk about the types of motions, I'm just going to talk about some ground rules that are generally applicable to lots of debates that you're going to have. So the first is that you should not assume that the debate is set in the US or any place in particular unless stated by the motion. You should generally assume that the motion takes place in functional democracies. So all arguments or examples from functional democracies should carry equal weight in debates generally. The second thing to talk about is fiat power. In general, government teams have a lot of fiat power, and other teams in the debate should assume that the government model or motion is able to be implemented and then debate the merits of that particular policy. So, for example, if the motion is this House would legalize all drugs in the US, as an opposition team, you cannot stand up and say, well, this would obviously never happen because Congress would never allow all drugs to be legalized. That might be true, but we need to debate the merits of the policy as though it were able to happen. The third thing to talk about are countermodels. So, there are a couple of rules that teams need to use when they use countermodels. The first is that the countermodels need to either be mutually exclusive or not incur the same harms as the government model. So, for example, if the motion is this House would legalize all drugs, it's legitimate for opposition to say, rather than legalizing all drugs, we would increase access to addiction treatment and make it free, but you need to explain why this should be done to the exclusion of legalizing drugs, because government teams can also expand addiction treatment as part of their model. The second thing to talk about is symmetric fiat power and use of resources. So opposition teams have the same amount of fiat power as government teams do to implement their countermodel, and they can use about the same amount of political capital or monetary resources or other resources as the government team uses in their model in the debate. So, for example, if the motion is this House would accept more asylum applicants as the US, on opposition, you can't say this House would just open all borders, because that obviously uses a lot more resources, both monetary resources and political capital, than the government team model does. So the fourth thing to talk about is time or place setting. You cannot time or place set motions. If the motion is supposed to take place in a particular time or place, it will say otherwise. In general, you assume it's in functional democracies and it's happening now. The next thing to talk about is challenging models. So in general, government teams have significant power to define the debate, and they shouldn't be challenged most of the time. If you are an opposition team or a closing government team who kind of wants to knife your government team because you think the model's unfair, you generally should not do this, and you should play ball with the government model if it is at all debatable. But there's a couple things on this. So first, sometimes government teams will choose very soft models as the way to implement their policy. So what I mean by that is it's a model that has very little efficacy, or maybe is does the motion, but only to a very small degree. So an example of this could be if it's this House would legalize all drugs, that maybe the government says we're only going to legalize marijuana. So as an opposition team, there's a couple things that you can say about this without necessarily challenging the model. You can point out that oftentimes soft models mean that the benefits or principle of the government team are significantly mitigated. So if I'm an opening government team and I choose to model that debate as only legalizing marijuana, and I argue that we should do this, one, to support people's autonomy, and two, to reduce mass incarceration, an opposition team could rightly point out that the fact that I've chosen to limit the scope of the debate to a very small category category of drugs probably means that I'm not really true to the principle of autonomy that I talked about, and also that I probably don't get a very big benefit on mitigating mass incarceration, because most people who are arrested for drug offenses are not arrested for marijuana. The third thing to talk about is if the government really has squirreled the motion and opposition teams feel like they have to challenge it to have a fair debate, there's three things that you should do. The first is you need to explain why the model is undebatable. So if the team's time or place said it, if it's a tautology, those are reasons that you need to point out to explain why it's an unfair interpretation of the motion. The second thing you need to do is you need to propose an alternative model or definition that you think is fair and within the spirit of the motion. And then the third is you need to engage with both. So you need to explain why your alternative model is preferable and how you would win if that were the model. And you also need to explain why you win on the model that you think is unfair. Okay, so that brings us to the first type of motions that we're going to talk about. So policy motions are this House would debates. And the question that you're answering in this debate is you are debating the policy as though you were the government of that country who is thinking about implementing this policy. So you're either a member of parliament or a member of Congress. And in general, for these debates, opening government teams should give a model. Some debates are more self-explanatory than others, and so if the model is pretty clear from the motion, sometimes government teams won't have to do a lot of work, but in general, government teams should model and explain what they think this policy is going to look like. So the second broad type of motions that I'm going to talk about are analysis motions, and I've divided this into some subcategories. So the first I'm going to talk about are this House supports or opposes motions, or this House believes that motions. So the question that you're asking in both of those debates is whether or not the statement is true from the perspective of a neutral observer. And this means that you are not, as a government team, expected to propose any particular policy, though often giving some definition to the debate can be helpful. So, for example, if the motion is this House opposes the rise of populist movements in Western liberal democracies, you don't, as a government team, need to give some kind of mechanism for banning populist movements or reducing populism. But it's probably helpful to explain what populism means in the debate as part of an opening government line. Also, on this House believes that debates, sometimes it's helpful to kind of define what types of policies you would support. So, for example, if the motion is this House believes that the United States should adopt single-payer healthcare, it's probably helpful to define what single-payer healthcare is and explain what that policy means, so you're not bound to the same strict implementation that you are in a this House would motion. The third thing to keep in mind about these debates is you need to give some metric for evaluating whether or not the statement is true to the judge. So give us some reason why we should why, as a neutral observer, we should support or oppose this type of policy or phenomena. The second type of analysis motion is this House prefers a world in which motions. So the debate that you're having in these motions is whether or not this statement is true. And something to keep in mind is that opposition has to make a comparison to the status quo or whatever the world is that's explained in the motion. So, for example, if the motion is this House prefers a world in which people maximize productivity to a world where people believe you should maximize leisure, you need to explain why it's preferable to live in a world where people maximize leisure. The next type is this House prefers X over Y. So this debate is about whether or not this particular statement is true. And again, op cannot countermodel or create a different counterfactual. They have to compare Y to X. So for example, this is silly, but if the debate where this House prefers chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream, you can't as opposition say, well, we prefer orange ice cream. That's obviously different and does not help in answering the question of whether or not X is preferable to Y. The next type of analysis motion I'm going to talk about is a "this House regrets" motion. So what this motion is asking you to evaluate is whether the world would have been better without the existence of the object of evaluation in the motion. So for example, if the motion is "this House regrets the rise of hookup culture," you are trying to evaluate whether or not the world would have been better without the existence of that thing at all. So the key to this debate is that you have to describe a counterfactual without that thing to compare. So as a government team, you should explain what the world would have looked like if there had not been hookup culture in a counterfactual, and compare that to the world with hookup culture. The next, and I think our last type of analysis motion, is a "this House believes that X should" debate. So the question you're asking in this debate is whether or not the statement is true from a neutral observer. And the key thing to note here is that this is different than an actor debate. So for example, if the motion is "this House believes that the United States should implement universal health care," that's different than "this House as the United States would implement universal health care." You're examining whether or not impacts, even exclusive to that particular actor, are good or bad in the debate, and whether or not in general for stakeholders in this debate this is a good or bad policy. So in general, government teams will need to have a model or explanation of the policy, and explain how, give some definitions for how this policy is going to be implemented. The next type of debate is an actor debate, which is what I talked about before. So this House as a particular actor should do a particular thing. This debate is from the perspective of the actor and whether or not it is in their best interest to do whatever the thing is in the debate. It's okay. So something that I think people sometimes get confused about in these types of motions is whether or not it's okay to use moral arguments. So it is fine to explain why the moral thing to do for that actor would be to take a particular course of action, but you need to explain why that moral calculus is relevant to that particular actor. Most people operate by some moral calculus, even if it's not necessarily in their best interest to do so. So you just need to explain why that's true for this actor and why they care about that particular moral calculus in order to make it work in the debate. All right, so that's all I have in terms of content. This presentation was taken heavily from the presentation that was given at the WUDC Cape Town judge briefing by the Adjudication Core. We thought that they did a really good job presenting this information, and so we followed a similar format in how we also presented it. So thank you so much for watching. Feel free to ask questions if you have any questions about this material.